The Bible is full of images expressing themes that run right through the whole narrative. We need to examine each of these images closely. We need to see how they all connect us to the larger story. We need to read the images. There's a strange moment in Mark's Gospel, chapter 8, when Jesus warns his disciples against the leaven of the Pharisees and Herod. Now, if I were just to read that out cold in church, most of the people listening would say, what on earth is he talking about? And indeed the disciples, I think, wondered what on earth Jesus was talking about, though for them they knew the significance of leaven, because ever since the Jewish Passover, way back when God rescued Israel from Egypt, the Passover meal was marked by the eating of unleavened bread. They had to clear out leaven because the bread had to be created quickly so that they could then leave Egypt in a hurry. And so thereafter, leaven became a symbol of something which dilutes the basic thing, which, makes the bread a different sort of thing, but if you use leaven as a metaphor thereafter, it's a way of saying, here is the true thing, and if you add leaven, you're kind of spoiling it somehow. So the disciples are initially puzzled because they say he's talking about bread, but we forgot to bring any bread. And Jesus says, no, that's not the point, and it wouldn't matter anyway, because shortly before then, Jesus has multiplied loaves and fishes, and he's done it twice actually, according to Mark chapter 6 and 8. This is something that happens again, that the crowds are hungry and Jesus feeds them, having started with very small helpings and then multiplying it so that everyone can eat. So what is Jesus talking about? He is warning that the Pharisees and the Herodians, that is, the people who are supporting Herod Antipas in his royal claims, they are diluting the kingdom message. Jesus is using bread as an image for the kingdom, that the kingdom which Jesus is inaugurating, which is God's sovereign saving rule on earth as in heaven, can be watered down, if you like, or leavened, to use the Jewish metaphor, both by the Pharisees, who think that the kingdom will come when everyone just keeps the Torah perfectly, and by the followers of Herod, who think that the kingdom will come when we all acknowledge that Herod is in fact the true king of the Jews. And Jesus says, no, neither of them get it. We need the real unleavened bread of the kingdom. And that goes almost straight on from there in Mark's Gospel to when Jesus takes his disciples away up north to Caesarea Philippi and says, who are people saying that I am? And they say, well, some say Elijah or one of the prophets or somebody like that. Who do you say that I am? And Peter says, you're the Messiah. And then Jesus starts to explain to them that he is going to have to go up to Jerusalem and suffer and be killed, and on the third day be raised. Well, the Pharisees and the Herodians never imagined that the kingdom of God would come like that. Jesus is warning them against diluted versions of the kingdom and instead pointing them to the true meaning of the kingdom, that he, Jesus, is the king who is coming. They're right to recognize him as such, even though he doesn't look much like people thought a Messiah would. But his road to messianic victory and glory is going to be the deeply paradoxical one of going the route of suffering and death. And Jesus refers to that, if you like, as the bread of the kingdom. And we find the same thing going on in John chapter 6, which is a much more elongated version of the discussion that Jesus has with the crowds after he has fed them in the desert with the bread. That's at the beginning of John chapter 6. And interestingly, immediately after that's happened, the crowds want to come and make him king, and Jesus withdraws to the mountain. But when he then meets them again and they start asking questions, it's all about, well, who do you think you are? And didn't Moses give us bread from heaven? Alluding back to Exodus chapter 16, where God gave manna from heaven so that the children of Israel could eat bread in the wilderness, a strange thing which went on throughout their wilderness wanderings, so that Jesus is saying then, no, it's not Moses who gives you the real bread. The real bread is that which I will give you. And then he moves on, just as he does in Mark 8. The bread which I will give is my flesh for the life of the world. So that bread becomes an image not just for the kingdom itself, but for Jesus himself and all that he is going to do. The bread of God is the one who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. It's like the manna, only in human form, John 6:33. The early church was bound to hear that promise in terms of the Eucharist, in terms of the bread and the wine which spoke so powerfully and still speak so powerfully of God's outpoured love in the death and resurrection of Jesus. The idea of God feeding us with himself, with his own very self. In paganism, when they had temples and offered sacrifices and so on, again and again, the image was of a hungry God who needs to be fed by human beings. And God says already in one of the Psalms, if I was hungry, I wouldn't actually tell you because I own the whole of creation. All the animals on the hills belong to me, so it wouldn't be a big deal. I wouldn't come knocking on your door to feed me. And so Israel basically knew that, but Jesus transposes this into a new key, that now the real bread is the one who comes down from heaven to give life to the world. Once again, the same thing we've seen elsewhere, that humans naturally think that our task is to find our way up to God, maybe offering him gifts on the way, whereas the whole Bible story is about God wanting to come and dwell with his people and to feed them with his own life and love. One of the images which celebrates that truth in the Old Testament is that in the tabernacle in the wilderness, when the priests were doing their regular duties, they would set aside 2 loaves on a special table to be the bread of the presence. It's sometimes translated in the older versions as the showbread, which is a way of saying we don't really know what it means, but it's on display there. But actually the Hebrew word there means bread of the face, that the face of God, the presence of God, is somehow symbolized by these loaves being there. And it seems to me that when Jesus is talking about giving his flesh for the life of the world, and when then he says with the bread, this is my body given for you, do this in remembrance of me, and when he talks about people feeding on him and drinking his blood, this is functioning the same way as the showbread, granted all the differences that there are between the tabernacle in the wilderness and the ongoing life of Jesus' followers in the church. That the bread of the Eucharist, of the Lord's Supper, this is the visible, tangible, edible reminder of, conveyor of, the very presence of Jesus himself. This is the bread of the face, the bread of the presence. One of the Eucharistic hymns which in my church we often sing, here, O my Lord, I see thee face to face. Here faith would touch and handle things unseen. That's all about the bread, which is one of the most ordinary things that humans make to eat, but now is taken up by God to be the vehicle of the most extraordinary thing you can imagine, namely the very presence of God himself, given to us in the breaking of the bread. Please feel free to click the link to watch the next video in this sequence.